What happens when the most powerful, most feared man in the city, a man who controls an entire criminal empire, completely loses his mind over the one person in his house he's supposed to ignore? Not a rival, not an informant, not a threat, just the quiet woman who scrubs the grout in his bathrooms. And then one ordinary evening she says 4 little words that crack his entire world wide open. "I have a date tonight. Stick around, because what happens next is the kind of obsession that destroys everything in its path." Cigarette ash dropped onto the imported rug, a dull grey smudge sinking into woven silk. He didn't even blink. He was too busy staring at the woman wringing out a sponge in his kitchen. Her name was Tessa, and she wasn't a rival, an informant, or a danger of any kind. She was just the girl who bleached the grout in his bathrooms. And yet, when she quietly mumbled that she'd be late tomorrow evening because she had a date, the air in the room didn't just freeze. It fractured. The harsh chemical smell of industrial bleach masked the faint scent of copper that sometimes haunted the lower halls of the estate. Tessa preferred the bleach. It was honest. It burned the inside of her nose and made her eyes water, but it did exactly what it promised to do. It erased things. She knelt on the cold marble of the kitchen floor, a yellow sponge gripped in her chapped red hands, the scrubbing side worn down to a fuzzy nub. Her knees ached, a dull, throbbing pain that radiated up her thighs, the kind that settles into the bone and stays there, a permanent reminder of her place in the world. The house was silent, a sprawling, sterile monument to new money and old sins, perched on a rocky cliffside overlooking the ocean. The windows ran floor to ceiling, thick bulletproof glass that held back the roaring wind, but also trapped the suffocating stillness inside. She didn't hear him walk in. He moved like a man who spent his whole life expecting the floor to give way beneath him. No footsteps, no clearing of the throat, just a sudden, heavy shift in the room's air pressure. Tessa felt the hair on the back of her neck prickle before she even saw him. She sat back on her heels, swiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of a damp wrist. He stood by the island, pouring himself a glass of water. His name was Nico, and he wore a dark suit with the tie already discarded, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He looked exhausted. Violet shadows bruised the skin under his eyes, and his jaw was rough with 3 days of stubble. He smelled of cold rain, stale tobacco, and the faint, bitter tang of expensive scotch. "Sorry," Tessa muttered, immediately dropping her gaze. It was a rule she'd made for herself months ago. Never look him in the eye for longer than 3 seconds. He wasn't a man. He was a weather event, a hurricane trapped in a tailored suit. "I'm just finishing the grout. I'll be out of your way." Nico didn't say anything. He lifted the glass to his lips, ice clinking sharply against the heavy crystal, the sound deafening in the quiet kitchen. He drank slowly, his eyes fixed on her over the rim. It wasn't a predatory stare. It was worse. It was an autopsy. He was picking her apart, observing the frayed hem of her uniform, the defensive hunch of her shoulders, the raw knuckles of her right hand. He hated that he noticed these things. He ran a syndicate that spanned the entire coast. He had shipping containers full of illicit cargo at the docks, politicians waiting on his calls, men who would kill or die on his word. And yet, for 4 months now, he knew exactly what time the maid took her lunch. He knew she drank her coffee black because she couldn't afford milk before payday. He knew the left heel of her work shoe squeaked on the hardwood. It was pathetic, a flaw in his system. He'd tried firing her twice in his head, but every morning she showed up smelling like cheap vanilla soap and exhaustion, and a strange, terrible calm settled over him. Tessa pushed herself up, grabbing the heavy bucket by its wire handle. She needed to speak. She'd been putting it off all day, dreading it. But tomorrow was Friday. If she didn't say it now, she'd lose the deposit on her reservation. "Mr. Falco," she started, her voice too thin. Nico set the glass down with a sharp clack. "What?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "I need to adjust my hours for tomorrow," she said, staring intently at the third button of his shirt. I'll come in at 5 in the morning instead of 7 to finish the upstairs. I have to leave by 4 in the afternoon. Nico frowned, a tiny tightening around his mouth. He didn't like changes to the schedule. Routine kept the paranoia at bay. Why? Tessa shifted her weight. The bucket sloshed. I won't be able to stay for the dinner cleanup. I asked why, Tessa, not what time. His voice was low and gravelly, vibrating with a quiet authority that made her stomach tighten. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. They were flat and unreadable, like dirty river water. I have a date tomorrow night. I need time to get ready. The words hung in the air, heavy and awkward. Nico didn't move. He didn't blink. But deep in his chest, right beneath the sternum, something violently snapped. A physical sensation, like a string breaking and lashing against his ribs. The air in his lungs suddenly felt hot and far too thin. A date. The concept was alien. It belonged to the normal world, the world of traffic jams and small talk over appetizers. It didn't belong in his house. It didn't belong to her. He looked at her. Really looked. Pale skin, no makeup, tired and small and entirely unremarkable. And yet, the thought of another man sitting across from her, buying her a drink, looking at her mouth, made a sickening wave of pure bile rise in his throat. A date, Nico repeated. The words tasted like ash. Yes. Tessa swallowed hard, her grip on the handle turning her knuckles white. She didn't understand his expression. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely blank, like a screen that had just lost its signal. Who? The word slipped out before his pride could stop it. Tessa blinked, caught off guard. Just someone, a guy from my neighborhood. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Some working-class guy who smelled of cheap cologne and drove a financed sedan. Someone who'd hold the door for her, ask about her day, completely oblivious to the fact that she spent her mornings scrubbing the evidence of his enemies out of the basement drains. Fine, Nico said smoothly, though his heart hammered an ugly rhythm against his ribs. Leave at 4. Make sure the security system is armed. He turned his back on her before she could reply, walking out with stiff, measured steps. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked at her again, he was terrified he might rip the bucket out of her hands and demand she cancel it. The thermostat in the office was set comfortably, but Nico was sweating. He sat behind his massive desk, the leather chair creaking. The room was dark, lit only by the harsh glow of a brass lamp. Outside, rain slapped against the reinforced glass like handfuls of gravel. He'd been trying to focus on the quarterly ledgers for 3 hours. Instead, his mind played a relentless, agonizing loop of a single sentence. I have a date. He reached for the scotch. Warm now. The ice melted, diluted into a sad, watered-down mess. He drank it anyway. It burned, but it didn't touch the suffocating knot in his chest. He was losing his mind. He knew it. He was a 34-year-old man who had ordered executions over cold plates of pasta. He did not care about the maid. He could not care about the maid. She was an employee, a utility, like the expensive system humming in the ceiling. But then he remembered the way she hummed when she thought she was alone in the East Wing. The smell of the cheap lotion she rubbed into her cracked hands on her breaks. The quiet, exhausted defiance in her eyes when he broke a glass and she had to sweep it up. She never complained, but she never cowered either. She just survived him. And Nico, a man who destroyed everything he touched, had become quietly obsessed with the one thing in his house that simply endured him. He slammed the empty glass down and pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling past names of politicians, fixers, and killers, stopping on a single contact. He pressed dial. It rang twice. Boss. The voice was thick with sleep. Past 1 in the morning. Wake up, Nico said, his voice flat, hiding the panic clawing at his insides. I need a run on someone. Pull the security footage from the front gate. Cross-reference the plates of whoever picks up Tessa tomorrow night at 6. A long, heavy silence on the line. Tessa. The cleaning girl. Did she steal something? No. He snapped it louder than he meant to, then forced his breathing to slow. She didn't steal anything. She's going out. I want to know who's taking her. Full background. Financials, criminal history, everything. On my desk by 7. You want a full workup on the Maid's date? The bewilderment was impossible to hide. Did I stutter? No, boss. I'm on it. Nico hung up and dropped the phone onto the desk. He leaned back and stared at the dark ceiling, feeling physically sick. He was abusing his power, invading her privacy, acting like a deranged, jealous teenager. He told himself it was security. She had access to the whole house. If she was dating someone, that someone was a potential vulnerability. It was standard protocol. It was a lie, and he knew it. He didn't care about security. He cared that tomorrow night, some faceless idiot was going to make her laugh. His hand curled into a fist, his nails biting into his own palm hard enough to break the skin. He welcomed the pain. It was grounding, a distraction from the humiliating ache in his chest. By 6 the next morning, the file was in his inbox. The guy's name was Simon. 32, a regional manager at a logistics firm. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket in 5 years. Good credit. He drove a sensible sedan. He volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends. He owned a golden retriever. He was sickeningly, outrageously normal. Nico scrolled through photos. Simon holding a fish he'd caught. Simon smiling at a company picnic in a beige polo. He had a kind, open face and a soft, non-threatening smile. Nico hated him with a sudden, violent intensity that frightened him. If Simon had been a thug or a deadbeat, Nico would have had an excuse to intervene. He could have played the protective employer. But Simon was a good man, a safe man, exactly the kind of man a woman like Tessa deserved. Someone who could offer her quiet weekends and a life entirely free of bulletproof glass and bleach. Nico turned the screen off. His own reflection stared back in the black glass. Dark eyes, a hard, unforgiving mouth, a man who dealt in threats and violence. He didn't fit into Tessa's world, and he knew with crushing certainty that dragging her into his would destroy her. He had to let her go. He had to stand back and watch her walk out the door into a normal life. He took a sip of cold coffee. It tasted like battery acid. Friday evening felt heavier than usual. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, suffocating humidity. Tessa stood in the small staff bathroom, staring at herself in the harsh mirror. She looked different, and she wasn't sure she liked it. She'd swapped her shapeless uniform for a dress she'd bought from a thrift store 2 years ago. Dark emerald green, cheap synthetic silk that clung slightly to her hips. It wasn't glamorous. The zipper was sticky. There was a tiny fray at one seam, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She'd brushed her hair into soft waves, applied a thin coat of drugstore mascara, and misted herself with vanilla body spray. Her stomach fluttered with nervous anxiety. She hadn't been on a date in 3 years. Between her mother's medical bills and the exhausting hours at the estate, romance was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Simon had been gently persistent when they met at the grocery store. He seemed safe, and God, she was so tired of being alone. She took a deep breath and opened the bathroom door. Nico was waiting in the foyer, not standing by the door, but sitting in the high-backed leather chair near the staircase, a newspaper open on his lap. But he wasn't reading. He was perfectly still, a predator feigning rest. He wore dark jeans and a black shirt stretched tight across his chest. He looked impossibly large in the dim light. Tessa's footsteps faltered. He slowly lowered the newspaper, the rustle loud as a gunshot. His eyes tracked her down the last 3 stairs, and the impact of seeing her hit him like a blow. The emerald brought out a hidden warmth in her pale skin. She looked fragile and beautiful, and entirely human. She didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like a woman who was leaving him behind. "Mr. Falco," she said, her voice tight. "I'm heading out. The security system is primed." Nico stood, saying nothing at first. Then he closed the distance, slow and deliberate. Tessa instinctively stepped back. her shoulder bumping the heavy oak door. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough to feel the heat off her skin, close enough to see the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. "You're taking a rideshare?" he asked, voice a low scrape. "No. He's picking me up at the main gate." "The gate is a half-mile walk in the dark," Nico said, conversational, though his eyes were dead. "I'll have a driver take you down." "That's really not necessary," Tessa said quickly, panic rising. "It's a nice evening. I don't mind the walk." "I mind," Nico said softly. She finally looked up. What she saw made her breath catch. Not anger. A dark, suffocating possessiveness, raw and unmasked. He was looking at her like she was something that belonged to him, something he was reluctantly letting out of its cage. "Mr. Falco," she started, trembling. "No," he corrected, his voice dropping. "You don't work for me right now, Tessa. You're off the clock. Call me Nico." The space between them felt electrified, heavy with unspoken things and a confusing dark pull. She wanted to run out the door. She also, terrifyingly, wanted to step closer. The contradiction made her dizzy. "I need to go," she whispered, her hand fumbling blindly for the doorknob. "I'll be late." Nico looked at her hand on the knob. He could stop her. All he had to do was wrap his hand around her wrist and tell her she wasn't leaving. The urge was a physical agony, tearing at his control. But then he saw the genuine fear in her eyes, that wide, trapped animal look. He slowly exhaled and stepped back, shoving his hands deep into his pockets so she wouldn't see them shaking. "Have a good time," he said. The words tasted like poison. Tessa didn't hesitate. She yanked the heavy door open and slipped out into the humid night. The lock engaged behind her with a solid metallic thunk. Nico stood in the empty foyer as the silence came rushing back, heavier than ever. The faint scent of vanilla lingered where she'd stood. He looked at his watch. He stood there for exactly 3 minutes, listening to his own pulse hammering in his ears. He's a good man. He's safe. Let her go. The rational thought played in his head, but it sounded hollow. Nico swore softly, grabbed the keys to the black SUV off the console table, and walked out the door. He didn't know what he was going to do. He just knew he couldn't sit in this empty house and picture another man's hands on her waist. He was going to follow her. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of mistake that got men in his position killed. But as his hand wrapped around the cold steering wheel, he didn't care. The rain started again, a fine, misty drizzle that smeared the streetlights into blurry halos. Nico kept 2 car lengths between his armored SUV and the sedan ahead. The tracking was effortless, a pathetic, agonizingly slow parade through the dreary suburbs. No evasive maneuvers. Simon drove 3 miles below the speed limit, braking a full 50 yards before every red light. Nico sat in the dark, the leather groaning under his white-knuckled grip, a man who orchestrated the movement of millions in contraband, and here he was burning premium gas to tail an HR manager to a gastropub. The self-disgust was a bitter metallic taste. The sedan finally pulled into the crowded lot of a place with a buzzing neon sign. Nico parked across the street in the shadow of a closed auto shop, killing the engine, watching through the rain-streaked windshield. He saw Simon step out, open an umbrella, and jog around to the passenger side, opening the door for Tessa, holding the umbrella over her as she stepped out into the puddles. Then, Simon placed a hand lightly on the small of her back to guide her toward the entrance, a polite, gentlemanly touch. Inside the dark cabin, Nico's hand dropped instinctively to the cold grip of the gun in his shoulder holster. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Stop it. You're losing your grip." He opened them and watched them disappear through the doors. He told himself to turn the key, put the truck in drive, and go back to his empty fortress. Let her eat her overpriced burger. Let her be normal. 5 minutes passed. He wiped a crude circle in the fogged glass and peered through it. He could see them in a booth near the front, the lighting warm and yellow. Simon talked animatedly with his hands. Tessa nodded, but Nico knew her. He knew the micro-expressions that meant she was retreating inward. Her shoulders were stiff. She wasn't relaxing into the booth. She was enduring it. When the waiter brought their drinks, Simon reached across and lightly touched the back of Tessa's hand. Tessa flinched. A tiny movement, barely a fraction of an inch, masked quickly as she reached for her water glass. But Nico caught it. That was it. The frayed, over-tightened string of his self-control snapped with a deafening internal crack. Nico shoved the door open and stepped out into the freezing drizzle, slamming the heavy armored door behind him. He crossed the wet asphalt, his strides long and predatory. He didn't know what he was going to do. He only knew that sitting in the dark while another man touched her was no longer physically possible. The bell over the door jingled merrily as he pushed inside. The air was thick and warm, smelling of fried garlic and stale beer. A jukebox played a muffled rock song over the chatter of 30 conversations. Nico stood in the entryway, a dark, imposing tear in the bright, mundane fabric of the room. He didn't march to their table. He wasn't a fool. He was a predator, and predators knew how to use space. He walked to the bar. The young bartender took one look at his dead eyes and the expensive cut of his suit and instantly forgot the joke he was telling. "What can I get you, sir?" "Bourbon. Neat. Leave the bottle." Nico sat on a stool facing the mirrored backing of the bar. From this angle, he had a perfect view of the reflection of Tessa's booth behind him. He poured 2 fingers into the glass but didn't drink. He just held it, eyes locked on the mirror. In the reflection, Simon was showing Tessa something on his phone, laughing. Tessa was forcing a smile, but her fingers were busy tearing a cardboard coaster into ragged shreds. An anxiety tick. Nico had seen her do it a dozen times, waiting for him to finish a phone call. Then Tessa looked up. Her gaze wandered the crowd as if searching for an exit, swept past the bar, moved on, and snapped violently back. In the mirror, their eyes met. The color drained from her face. Her hand jerked, knocking her water glass. It tipped, spilling across the table. She couldn't breathe. The chatter, the jukebox, the smell of food, it all dropped away into a ringing, terrified silence. Nico was here, sitting at the bar, watching her in the mirror. He wasn't glaring. His expression was blank, cold, and utterly terrifying, the look of a man calculating exactly how to dismantle a problem. And right now, Simon was the problem. "Oh, shoot!" Simon said, grabbing napkins. "You all right, Tessa?" She didn't hear him. Her hands trembled under the table. Why was he here? No. She knew exactly why, and the realization sent a cold spike of panic through her stomach. "Tessa, you look like you just saw a ghost." She tore her eyes from the mirror and forced herself to look at his kind, oblivious face. "I'm fine, just swallowed wrong. Excuse me, I need the restroom." She scrambled out of the booth, head down, and practically sprinted toward the back, where a dim exit sign glowed. Nico watched her reflection disappear into the hallway. He set the glass down, didn't leave a tip, turned on his stool, and followed. AI chat. Tessa didn't go to the restroom. She hit the push bar of the heavy steel service door, shoving it open with her shoulder, and stumbled out into the narrow alley behind the pub. The cold, wet air hit her flushed face like a slap. She leaned against the rough brick, pressing her hands to her chest as if she could slow her own heart. The alley smelled of wet garbage and grease. A dying bulb flickered erratically overhead. She closed her eyes, dragging oxygen into her burning lungs. She was losing her mind. Mr. Falco didn't follow the help. This was a coincidence. He had business nearby. The steel door groaned open again. Her eyes flew open. Nico stepped out, the door clicking shut behind him, cutting off the muffled noise of the pub, leaving them alone in the damp, flickering dark. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood a few feet away, rain misting over his shoulders, the dim light carving harsh shadows into his jaw. He looked like a shark dragged into a shallow pool. "What are you doing here?" Her voice shook badly. He took a slow step forward, glass crunching under his boot. "Getting a drink." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, a desperate flare of anger piercing the terror. You drink scotch that costs more than my rent. You live in a fortress on a cliff. This is a strip mall. You followed me." Nico stopped. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping away the anger to find the terrified core underneath. He didn't offer an excuse. "Yes," he said softly. "I followed you." The sheer, unapologetic honesty knocked the breath out of her. She pressed harder against the wall. "Why?" He stepped closer, stopping inches away. The smell of him, rain and bourbon and dark male heat, overpowered the alley. She had to tilt her head back. He raised a hand and she flinched, but he didn't touch her. He planted his palm flat against the wet brick beside her head, boxing her in. "Because," he said, his voice a low vibration she felt in her chest, "you look like you're attending a funeral in there. You're tearing coasters to pieces. Your shoulders are up to your ears. He touched your hand, and you looked like you wanted to crawl under the table. You're miserable." "He's a nice man," Tessa argued, feeling the argument crumble. "He's normal. I want nice. I want normal." "You want a pulse," Nico said, his voice harsh, laced with bitterness. "You're bored to tears. He doesn't see you, Tessa. He sees a quiet girl in a green dress. He doesn't know what you are." "And what am I?" she challenged, her chin tipping up, a spark of defiance fighting through the fear. "I'm the girl who scrubs the basement drains. I'm the girl who cleans up after your messes, Mr. Falco." His jaw tightened. The words hit him precisely because they were true. He hated what he'd dragged her into. "Don't call me that. Not tonight." "That's who you are. You're my boss. You're a dangerous man. And you have no right to be here, ruining the one normal night I've had in 3 years. "I'm not ruining it," Nico said, leaning a fraction closer. "I'm ending it. You're going back inside, telling him you have a headache, and coming with me." She stared, stunned by the audacity. "No." His eyes darkened, the dead look replaced by a chaotic storm of possessiveness. He pulled his hand from the wall and hovered it inches from her waist, fingers twitching, fighting the urge to grab her. "Tessa," he warned. "No," she repeated louder, pushing her hands against his chest. It was like pushing a concrete pillar. "You don't own me. You buy my time from 7 to 4. It's 7:30 on a Friday. You do not own me." Nico looked down at her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic flutter of her pulse through her palms. She was terrified of him, and yet she was fighting him. It was intoxicating, maddening. "Go back inside then," he said suddenly, his voice dropping to a hoarse, jagged whisper. He stepped back, putting 2 feet of cold air between them. She blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Go back inside. Go sit in the booth. Let him buy you another water. Let him touch your hand." He held her gaze, his eyes burning. "But know this. If you go back in there and let him put his hands on you again, I won't just sit at the bar and watch." The threat wasn't loud. It was delivered with the calm, chilling certainty of a man who dealt in absolute destruction. Tessa stood frozen against the wet brick. She looked at him, the dark, unraveling man in the rain, and for the first time she realized he wasn't just dangerous to others. He was dangerous to himself. And he was dragging her down with him. The rain came harder now. She stared at him, the flickering light catching the sharp angles of his face. He meant every word. If she walked back in there, he'd tear the whole evening apart. Not with shouting, not with a punch. He'd just walk over, a predator invading a petting zoo, and dismantle Simon with the sheer terrifying weight of what he was. And Simon, a man whose biggest daily stress was supply chains, wouldn't survive the proximity. Tessa closed her eyes. Rainwater ran down her cheeks, mixing with hot tears of frustration. "You're a monster," she whispered. Not an insult, a quiet, devastating statement of fact. Nico didn't flinch. He just stood there, letting the rain wash over him. "I know." She opened her eyes, wiping her wet face. The anger was still there, but beneath it was a crushing exhaustion. She'd spent 3 years fighting for a sliver of normal. she'd saved for the dress. And in 5 minutes, this man had ripped it all down to the studs. She pushed away from the wall and walked past him, giving him a wide berth, reaching for the steel door. He didn't try to stop her. He just turned, watching her yank it open. The blast of warm air hit her face, a sickening contrast to the freezing rain. She stepped inside, the door groaning shut behind her. The pub was just as loud, just as crowded. Nobody had noticed the plates of her life shifting violently beneath her feet. She walked back to the booth. Simon looked up, his face softening with relief. "Hey, everything okay? You were gone a while." He noticed her wet hair, his brow furrowing. "Did you go outside?" Tessa slid into the booth. She didn't look at the bar, but the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She knew he was watching. "Simon," she started, her voice cracking. She forced herself to look at his kind, decent face. The guilt was a heavy weight. "I'm so sorry, I don't feel well at all. I think it might be a migraine. The lights, the noise." "Oh no," Simon said immediately, genuine concern, no suspicion. He reached for his wallet. "Say no more. Let me get the check and I'll drive you home." No. Too fast, too sharp. Simon froze. She scrambled to soften it. "I mean, my house is the opposite direction. I already called a ride. It's pulling up now." He frowned, confused. "Tessa, it's pouring out there. Let me at least walk you out." "Simon, please," she whispered, pleading with her eyes. "Let it go. Please, I just need to leave right now. I'm so sorry about the evening." He stared at her a long second. He wasn't stupid. He could see the terror vibrating through her small frame. He didn't understand it, but he recognized that she was cornered. Slowly, he put a card on the table to cover the drinks. "Okay," he said softly, holding his hands up in surrender. "Okay, if you're sure." "I am. Thank you." She was already sliding out, grabbing her purse. She turned her back on the safe, normal life in that booth and walked fast toward the doors, eyes fixed on the glowing sign in the window. She pushed out into the freezing downpour. The sedan sat in the lot, empty, and directly across the street, idling in the shadow of the closed auto shop, was the black armored SUV. Headlights off, the engine a deep, low rumble she could feel in the soles of her shoes. She couldn't see inside the rain-sheeted windshield. She didn't need to. Tessa pulled her purse tight, ducked her head, and crossed the street. She grabbed the heavy handle and pulled. It opened with a solid metallic thunk. She climbed into the passenger seat, surrounded by the smell of leather and his cologne, and slammed the door. The heavy armor sealed out the world entirely, plunging the cabin into suffocating silence. Nico didn't say a word. He didn't look at her. He shifted into drive and the vehicle glided away from the curb. Tessa sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, shaking with a deep, uncontrollable tremor. The adrenaline that had carried her out was evaporating, leaving a cold, hollow disbelief. What had she just done? She'd lied to a perfectly good man, run out like a criminal. And now she was in the passenger seat of a war machine, driven by a man who bought politicians and ordered violence over his morning coffee. The silence stretched. They hit the highway, streetlights passing in hypnotic orange flashes. In one of them, she looked at him, both hands gripping the wheel, knuckles stark white, jaw locked tight, a muscle ticking beneath his eye. He didn't look victorious. He looked entirely hollowed out, staring at the wet road with a grim, punishing intensity. The anger flared back, hot and bitter. "Did you enjoy that?" He kept his eyes on the road. "No. You ruined it." The words tasted like copper. "I hadn't been out in 3 years. 3 years, Nico. I just wanted to sit in a booth and listen to someone talk about their dog. I just wanted to pretend I belonged in that world." His grip tightened until the leather groaned. "You don't belong in that world." "And I belong in yours?" She shot back, the wall of the subservient Maid crumbling to dust. She turned to face him fully. "I scrub bleach into your grout. I sweep up the glass when your men break things. I live in a studio above a laundromat. Don't act like this is about where I belong. This is about you. You couldn't stand the idea of something existing that you didn't control. Nico let off the gas, the SUV slowing. He didn't yell back. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low, so rough, she almost couldn't hear it. You think I want this? His eyes flicked over to her, and the raw agony in them made her breath hitch. You think I want to sit in a dark office at 2 a.m. running background checks on a man who volunteers at an animal shelter? You think I enjoy knowing exactly how many sugar packets you put in your coffee or recognizing the sound of your footsteps on the stairs? He dragged a hand down his face. I am a plague, Tessa. Everything I touch rots. I've known it since I was 20. I try to keep you in the periphery. I try to stay out of the rooms you're cleaning. But then you smile at the landscaper, or you hum when you think the house is empty, and it feels like someone is driving a spike through my chest. She stared at him, paralyzed. The raw confession hung in the air. He wasn't flexing his power. He was admitting a fatal weakness. Then why did you make me leave? She whispered, the anger dissolving into a confusing ache. Because I am selfish, Nico said, heavy and absolute. He turned to look at her fully for the first time since she got in. Because seeing another man touch you made me want to burn the entire building to the ground. And if you'd stayed, I would have. He turned back to the road. I saved him, Tessa, not you. I pulled you out to save him from me. She slumped back, her lungs refusing to draw enough air. He wasn't protecting her from a bad date. He was protecting the world from his obsession with her. The rest of the drive passed in heavy silence. The hostility was gone, replaced by a dark, magnetic pull that terrified her far more than his anger. They turned onto the private gravel road up the cliffs. The towering gates loomed out of the fog. Nico hit a button, and they swung open, then locked shut behind them with a final clang. Tessa felt a cold shiver. She wasn't arriving at 7 a.m. in her grey slacks with a bucket. She was arriving at 9 at night, dripping wet in a green dress, brought here by the master of the house. The lines had been crossed. There was no going back to the bleach and the silence. The house was dark when they walked in, save for the ambient security lights casting long shadows across the marble. They stood in the entryway, the door locked behind them, both of them soaked. Water dripped from her dress, forming a dark puddle. Tessa's training kicked in, a desperate grab for something familiar. I'm dripping on the floor, she mumbled. I need a towel. The water will warp the finish. She didn't make it 2 steps. Nico's hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist. Not painful, but absolute. She froze, her breath catching. She looked down at his hand, then slowly up to his face. He was staring at her, the exhaustion and self-loathing from the car gone, replaced by a dark, volatile hunger. The veneer of the composed boss had cracked entirely, leaving only a raw, unanchored man in an empty house. Leave it, he said, his voice a gravelly scrape. It's going to stain, she whispered, her heart hammering. She tried a half-hearted tug. He didn't let go. I don't care about the floor, Tessa. He tugged her gently toward him. She stumbled, closing the distance until she stood inches from his chest, the heat off his body cutting through her freezing clothes. He lifted his free hand, hesitant, almost jerky, and gently touched the side of her face. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tiny gasp escaping. His thumb was rough, but his touch impossibly light, brushing a wet strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers sliding into the damp hair at the nape of her neck. Open your eyes, he commanded softly. She did. The air between them hummed with a terrifying gravity. She looked up and saw her own fear reflected back, mingled with an answering heat she didn't want to acknowledge. You ruined this, she told him, her voice shaking. She wasn't talking about the date anymore. She was talking about her job, her safety, her sanity. I'm the maid. You're the boss. This doesn't happen. I broke the rules months ago, Nico admitted, his voice rough, his thumb stroking her jaw. I was broken long before tonight. I have to work tomorrow, she whispered, a final plea to reason. I have to scrub the bathrooms. No, you don't, Nico said, his hand at her neck tightening slightly, angling her face toward his. You are never touching a bucket in this house again. Her breath hitched. The reality crashed over her. She was no longer staff. She was something else entirely, something closer, something infinitely more dangerous. She looked at his mouth. He was so close she could feel his breath. The contradiction inside her tore her apart. The terror of what he was warring with a deep, buried desire to stop fighting the world and let him fight it for her. Nico, she breathed out, using his name for the first time. Something feral and broken snapped behind his eyes at the sound of it. He dropped her wrist and wrapped both arms around her waist, crushing her against his chest, his mouth coming down on hers. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, the collision of a man starving and a woman realizing she was the feast. He kissed her like he wanted to erase the hours she'd spent with another man. Tessa gasped, her hands flying up to push against his chest. But the push turned into a desperate grip, her fingers curling into his wet shirt, anchoring herself as the room spun. He backed her up across the marble until her back hit the heavy door with a solid thud. She could feel the cold metal of the gun in his holster pressing against her ribs, a terrifying reminder of exactly who she was kissing. A man who dealt in death. And yet, pinned against the door of his fortress, she didn't feel like a maid scrubbing out the stains of his life. She felt alive, electric, terrifyingly seen. Nico finally broke the kiss, dragging his mouth across her jaw to press his face into the damp crook of her neck, breathing in ragged, uneven pulls like a man who'd just outrun a bullet. Tessa kept her hands clutched in his shirt, staring blindly up at the dark ceiling, the rain still lashing against the bulletproof glass. Tomorrow, the reality of this would hit them both. The syndicate, the danger, the permanent destruction of her quiet life. But tonight, standing in a puddle of water in the dark, Tessa knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty. She was never going back to the bleach. So here's what I keep turning over in my mind about these two. On the surface, it's a story about obsession, a powerful man who can't control the one feeling he never asked for. But underneath that, there's a much harder question. Is what Nico feels actually love, or is it just another form of control wearing a prettier mask? Because a man who runs a background check on your date, who follows you through the rain, who tells you that you'll never be free of him, that's not romance in the real world. That's a warning sign. And yet the story makes you feel the pull, doesn't it? The terrible magnetism of being wanted that completely by someone that powerful. That's exactly what makes a character like Nico so dangerous and so fascinating to watch. And there's Tessa, caught between the safe, ordinary life she thought she wanted and the storm she can't seem to walk away from. 3 years she fought for one normal night, and in 5 minutes it was gone. The real tragedy isn't that Nico ruined her date. It's that some part of her was relieved to stop fighting, to stop surviving the world alone, even if the thing offering to fight it for her might be the very thing that destroys her. That's the choice she's standing in front of now, and it's the kind of choice that never has a clean answer. If your heart was pounding through that intense, messy collision between Nico and Tessa, then you already know this isn't your average fairy tale. We just crossed the point of no return, from the silent maid to the obsession of the most dangerous man in the city. And the question, hanging over everything, is whether he can actually protect her from his own violent world, or whether being his weakness is the thing that gets her killed. So, do me a favor and smash that like button if you felt the tension in this one. Share this story with someone who loves a raw, grounded, darkly addictive romance. And if you want to find out what happens the morning after, when the reality of his world comes crashing into her life, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. And drop a comment down below and tell me honestly, do you think a man like Nico can ever really protect someone he loves from himself? Or is Tessa walking straight into something she'll never escape? There's no easy answer, and I genuinely want to hear what you think. I read every single comment, and the best ones just might shape where this story goes next. So don't be shy. Let's hear it.